Welcome to your deep dive today. We're heading to Australia, but forget the usual touristy stuff. We're
Mhm.
going deeper. We're going to uncover a really dark and honestly often overlooked period in history, the treatment of Aboriginal Australians.
Yeah, it's a heavy one, that's for sure. A history that goes back at least 65,000 years, long before, British ships ever even showed up. We're going to be looking at the impact of colonization on a people who had already, built these thriving societies. They had their own laws, customs, spiritual connection to the land, the whole deal.
And we've got a ton of articles and research piled up here ready to unpack this whole thing. It's a story of resilience for sure, but also immense suffering. Some historians even call it the Black War, others, the Tasmanian Genocide. So, right off the bat, we're dealing with some heavy terms. We'll unpack what those terms even mean, what they reveal about this time. And get this, genetic studies show a direct link between Aboriginal Australians today and those who lived through these very events.
It's true, yeah. It's a powerful reminder that history isn't just, dates in a textbook. It's carried in the very DNA of a people. And before we get into the upheaval of colonization and all that, I think it's really crucial to understand how established Aboriginal life was. We're talking about an estimated population of 750,000 to 1.25 million people.
Wow, those numbers are. They're really something. So we're not talking about just scattered tribes here. This was a population larger than a lot of European nations at the time.
Oh, absolutely. And within that population, you had this whole rich tapestry of different cultures. We're talking about two main groups, the Aboriginal people of mainland Australia and the Torres Strait Islanders, each with their own languages, social structures, ways of life, all developed over, tens of thousands of years.
So 1788 rolls around. The British, they set up shop, and, well, we know what often happens next, right? Conflict. But I gotta say, going through these sources, it's clear that this was way more than just a clash of cultures.
Yeah, no, you're right. This wasn't some disagreement over land use or something. It was a sustained and honestly often brutal campaign of displacement and violence against Aboriginal people. And, it's important to be upfront about the fact that the term war, like in the Black War, it's heavily debated.
Yeah, there's a lot of back and forth about whether it was officially a declared war or not.
Exactly. And some historians argue that using that label, it kind of sanitizes the atrocities that happened. It makes it sound like a fair fight, two equal sides. And
Yeah.
that just wasn't the case.
Right, right. Regardless of what we call it, the impact, it was devastating. We're talking at least 311 documented massacres over 140 years. It's a lot.
Yeah, it's heavy stuff. And it wasn't just the British military calling the shots either. Colonial authorities, the, empowered settlers, police forces, they even created these native police units, which tragically often meant turning Aboriginal people against each other.
Man, that's a chilling detail. It really points to this deliberate effort to divide and conquer. It's easy to just focus on the violence of the massacres themselves, but the sources paint this picture of suffering that went way beyond just direct killings.
Absolutely. I mean, it's crucial to understand that European diseases, things like smallpox, measles, influenza, all of that, they just ripped through Aboriginal populations. They had no immunity to this stuff.
It's easy to forget about the impact of diseases, but in a lot of ways, it was just as destructive as any weapon.
No doubt. Some estimates say that disease was responsible for a huge percentage of Aboriginal deaths during colonization. And this wasn't just an accident, a consequence of contact, right? It was a tool of dispossession. There are accounts of colonists intentionally spreading diseases. They saw it as a way to, clear the land.
To think that they would use disease as a weapon, it's just, ugh, it feels overwhelming to even grasp the scale of what happened.
It's a painful history, that's for sure. We can't delve into every single event, but I think maybe focusing on a few specific instances might help make the human cost of this era a little more, tangible.
I think that's a good approach. To really understand the impact, we have to move beyond the statistics.
Right, exactly. So let's start. 1791, in a place called Toongabbie. Today it's a suburb of Sydney. But back then, the governor, he'd granted land to these former convicts. But here's the thing. These men, they were given the authority to use their muskets against any Aboriginal person they deemed a nuisance.
Wow. So basically a license to kill.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just an empty threat either. There are tons of accounts of Aboriginal people being shot for, just existing on their own land. One account, it's really chilling. It details this murder of 4 Aboriginal farm workers. Chased down, killed, and to make matters worse, they put their severed heads on display. as a warning.
Oh my God, that is barbaric. What possible justification could there be for that level of cruelty?
Well, and this is important. It wasn't about justice, right? This was about power, about instilling terror and asserting dominance.
Hmm.
And it wasn't a random act of violence. This was part of this whole pattern of dehumanization they used
Yeah.
to justify taking the land and resources from Aboriginal Australians.
It's like they wanted to send a message, this land is ours now, and resistance means brutal force.
Yeah. It's a stark reminder of how fear was used as a tool of oppression.
Yeah.
And tragically, this was just one of many, many instances like it.
Yeah. Awful.
Just a few years later, so 1795, we see this other example of escalating violence. 2 colonists, they were killed, and the retaliation, it was swift and brutal. A force of 66 soldiers, they're ordered to kill any Aboriginal person they encounter. And it gets worse, they were told to hang the bodies, including children and pregnant women, to instill fear, to prevent any further resistance.
This is just horrific. It's a complete disregard for human life. It's just a chilling glimpse into, the dark side of colonial expansion. It makes you wonder, amidst all this darkness, were there any attempts at resistance at all?
It's kind of like the first question you ask yourself, right? Faced with that kind of brutality, you'd think resistance is almost, like, impossible.
Totally. How could anyone even begin to fight back against that,
And yet they did. The Aboriginal people, they weren't just passive victims in this story. And one of the most, I think, powerful examples of their resilience, the refusal to be broken, is the story of Pumulway.
Poway, yeah. His name, it comes up again and again in these accounts. Anytime you read about Aboriginal resistance to colonization, he's there. Who was he exactly?
So Pumulway, he was a Bidjigal warrior, born around 1750 in the Botany Bay area. He became this, like, legendary figure, not just among his own people, but even among the colonists. They feared him.
What was it about him that made him such a symbol of resistance?
Well, for one thing, he was known for his, like, strategic mind on the battlefield. He understood the land, how to use it to his advantage. He led tons of attacks against the colonists, and often he would target those who had committed violence against his people specifically. He was a skilled warrior, no doubt, but he was also this charismatic leader who just, like, inspired others to fight back.
He sounds like a true leader, a figure who embodied that spirit of resistance, especially at a time when hope must felt impossible to find.
Exactly. And kind of like those figures from other cultures, the ones who fought against oppression. Think Spartacus, think William Wallace. The more the colonists tried to, like, stamp him out, the bigger his legend grew.
There's this one story about a battle in 1797, the Battle of Parramatta, where Pumulway was wounded. What happened there?
So Pumulway and his warriors, they were planning this huge attack on the colony of Parramatta, but they were betrayed. British forces surprised them at night, ambushed them, and during the attack, Pumulway, he was shot 7 times, once in the head even.
7 times. He survived that. It's almost like something out of a movie.
Right. It's pretty incredible. Among the Aboriginal people, the belief was that he was protected by these powerful ancestral spirits. But what's even crazier is that despite these insane injuries, he still managed to escape from the hospital where they were holding him, no less.
Escapes from a colonial hospital after being shot 7 times. Man, you really can't make this stuff up. No wonder he became such a legend.
Exactly, and it kind of highlights this important point, right? Resistance. It came in many forms. Yeah, there were the armed uprisings like the ones Pumulway led, but there was also the cultural preservation, maintaining traditions in secret, even just the act of surviving in the face of all this. That was resistance too.
That's such a good point. Resistance, it isn't always about, open rebellion. It's about holding on to who you are, your culture, in the face of everything trying to erase you.
And sadly, those forces of erasure, they took on these new, like, insidious forms in the 20th century with what we call the stolen generations.
So this is what, over 100 years after the first fleet arrives. By this point, Aboriginal Australians are living in a country that's completely reshaped by colonization. What were the stolen generations exactly?
Well, from the early 1900s all the way to the 1970s, Australian government policies led to the forced removal of Aboriginal children from their families.
I mean, what could even justify that? Taking children from their parents is just, I don't even know what to say.
It was based on this racist and completely unfounded belief that Aboriginal children would be better off raised by white families or in, like, state-run institutions. They thought these kids would have a better chance in life if they were assimilated into white society.
So let me get this straight. Children were taken from their families, their languages, their entire culture, all to give them a so-called better life.
Yeah, that was the messed up logic they used. These kids, they were often forbidden from speaking their native languages, their names were changed. Any connection they had to their culture was, like, systematically severed. Imagine the trauma of that, having your identity ripped away from you like that.
It's hard to even comprehend the pain, the lasting impact of that kind of loss.
Yeah. And the legacy of the stolen generations, it's still felt in Aboriginal communities today. You have all these individuals still searching for their families, trying to piece together their stolen identities. It's this profound sense of loss that comes with cultural dispossession.
It's heartbreaking. But it's something we need to understand if we're going to even begin to understand the fight for Aboriginal rights in Australia.
Absolutely. And that's a fight that's still going on today.
It's a lot to take in, this whole journey through such a complex and frankly heartbreaking part of history.
Yeah, no doubt. But it's also a history of resilience. It's about a people determined to hold on to who they are against all odds. It makes you think about how deeply those times still resonate today.
It really does. One thing that stuck with me from all this research was this one study we came across. It found a direct genetic link between Aboriginal Australians living today and their ancestors who lived through all of this, all that upheaval.
Yeah, that's a powerful finding. Really drives home the point that despite the violence, the attempted eradication, the forced assimilation, they survived. Their culture, it
Yeah.
survived. That connection to this land, this connection that goes back thousands of years, it couldn't be broken.
It's amazing when you think about it. Every Aboriginal community, they carry this weight of history,
Yeah.
the stories of their ancestors, the pain, the resistance, that unbroken thread.
Exactly. And that's why true reconciliation, it's not just about, saying sorry for the past. It's about understanding that those wrongs, they have a lasting impact. The fight for Aboriginal rights, it didn't end with the stolen generations.
Right. It wasn't until, what was it, 1965, that Aboriginal Australians were even considered full citizens. Like they couldn't even vote before then.
That's right. And then even after that, it took another 2 years for that referendum to pass, the one that actually let the government make laws for Aboriginal people.
It's crazy to think about now that for so long, Aboriginal Australians were denied the most basic rights.
It shows you how deep that racism ran, how it shaped Australian society. And look, while things have gotten better, the fight for real equality, for justice, for a voice, it's not over.
And that brings us to the 2023 referendum, right? The one that would have made a place for an Indigenous voice to Parliament written right into the Constitution.
Exactly. If that had passed, it would have given Indigenous Australians a direct say in the policies that affect their lives. It was a chance for real change, a chance to address the inequality that still exists.
And it failed, which is kind of shocking considering the majority of Indigenous Australians, they voted for it.
Yeah. And it just goes to show you how complex this journey is. Even with all that support, the referendum couldn't convince enough of the non-Indigenous population. There's still a lot of work to do, a lot of bridges to build.
It's like those injustices from the past. They still have power. And to fix that, it takes more than words. It takes action. And it takes listening to those who have been silenced for far too long.
That's it. It's about amplifying those voices, understanding, and then working together to create a better future for everyone.
We've covered a lot of ground today. It's a heavy story, full of pain, injustice, but also incredible resilience and strength.
It's a story that needs to be told.
It absolutely does. And to everyone listening, this is just the start. If anything we've talked about today resonated with you, keep learning, keep digging. There are so many stories out there just waiting to be heard. For now, though, we'll leave you with this. The fight for justice, for equality, it's a marathon, not a sprint. And it's one we have to run together. Until next time.